Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Chi Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
In this episode, host Bill Kelly welcomes Joe Simonian, a prominent figure in the world of financial data science and the chairman of the Financial Data Professional FDP Institute. Joe shares insights from his extensive career spanning over 18 years in global asset management and financial data science. The discussion traverses the evolution of quantitative tools in finance, the nascent but promising applications of generative AI, and the critical need for synthetic datasets in investment strategies. The episode wraps up with an exploration of the FDP Institute, emphasizing the growing need for cross-disciplinary expertise in today's rapidly evolving investment landscape. Listen in.
Joe Simonian, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here.
A pleasure. And it's funny, we joke about this every time I see you. We live maybe 2 miles apart. And I think other than a purposeful coffee in Newton Center, I don't think I've ever run into you in town. I run into you in London and New York and other places, but Newton, not so much.
Yeah, Newton's a funny place.
Yeah, big city, but it's good to be talking to a local. We have a fair amount to cover. There's many common threads beyond Newton, Massachusetts, and maybe most notably the FDP Institute, the Chi Association started circa 2018. You were involved on the advisory board from the very beginning, but now more deeply involved, and we'll cover that in a moment. But you've had a very interesting career, I would say a who's who of large global asset managers where you've spent various stints. You're an author, a journal editor. So maybe in not quite 30 seconds or less, maybe a little bit of a thumbnail on Joe Simonian.
Yeah, just professionally, over 18 years experience, most recently at Scientific Beta, also the founding co-editor of the Journal of Financial Data Science. I serve on the board of the Journal of Portfolio Management. I'm on the technical committee of the CFA Institute. And last but not least, chairman of the FDP Institute, which was a recent appointment, as you alluded to. I have written quite a bit throughout my career, over 40 publications in peer-reviewed journals. I have a book out with Frank Fabozzi and Georgi Konstantinov on global fixed income, and I have a new book coming out towards the end of this year on global macro. So the tentative title is Computational Global Macro, where we apply machine learning and game theory to thematic global macro problems and ideas.
And you were very early with somebody that rose to very senior roles with more of a science, data science, maybe mathematical background. And I grew up in the asset management industry where using quantitative tools was alive and well, and you were probably at the forefront of that. So maybe I could start there, but I do want to get into the evolution of generative AI and where the industry is, but maybe start a little bit with your educational background and how somebody, maybe mathematicians, was hardwired to move into the quantitative side. I don't know if that was your path or not, but it'd be interesting to hear a little bit on that.
My initial intent was to be a logician. So some of the listeners may know who Kurt Gödel is. He was really my idol growing up. He has a set of theorems called incompleteness theorems. They're very famous in mathematical logic and computability theory. They have ramifications for AI as well. So I studied philosophy and math for all my undergrad. And then in grad school, I focused on mathematical logic, which again is an area that breaches or broaches computer science, philosophy, and math. In the middle of my PhD program, I really started to focus a little bit more on game theory because I had an eye of going to Wall Street, which again, as you know, game theory is a much more economically oriented application of logic. But the reason that I had actually a fairly deep background in AI by the time I had gone to Wall Street, and even way before data science was really a thing, if you will, is because logic, as I alluded to, really is connected to computability theory. And there are certain kinds of logics, modal logics, epistemic logics. These are logics that are applied to different kinds of cognition, really. And they've been used for decades in artificial intelligence. And I was very, very familiar with these logics and AI as a whole because of my entree into these logics. So when the data science revolution, let's call it, rolled around, I really had a step ahead of a lot of folks because who thought it would come in handy? Because the funny thing is, in math departments, it's a little bit of a joke that the logicians are typically the bottom feeders, or they have been historically. It's the number theorists and the topologists and so on that get all the headlines and all the stardom, if you will. But logic really has come back with a vengeance because computability theory and AI and all these applications of various types of logic are very important. And so when it came to actually contributing to the field and laying the groundwork with others, obviously nobody does anything alone, of financial data science, I found that ahead of the game a little bit, at least in terms of my research ideas and practical applications. The funny thing is it's the flip side. So when I got to Wall Street, even though I was mathematically fairly sophisticated, I had to do a lot of studying up on traditional econometrics and option pricing theory and things of that nature. But the data science and AI side of it, I was actually ahead of everybody. So it's kind of a little bit of a different course than the average quant takes, but I think it all worked out in the end.
Yeah, you've done okay for a bottom feeder, I would say. As I mentioned a moment ago, Joe, I've spent 40 plus years in this industry, the last 10 at Kaya, but the first 30 on the buy side of asset management. And I saw even back then fundamental shops where I primarily worked had embraced quantitative tools. And if you're going to be doing some screening, you've got to take thousands of stocks and get it down to a shorter shopping list. So that is alive and well. But the next wave hitting the beach might be now around the use of generative AI and trying to figure out how to weaponize all this old data. So where is the state of the union there? I assume there are probably some very sophisticated shops that have embraced this wholesomely. But by and large, I still wonder if we're in the very early innings and maybe nascent with some organizations in really deploying AI as part of the wholesome investment process.
It is nascent, as you mentioned. However, I think there are some direct applications of it. So generative AI, there's an expansive definition. I'll give it somewhat of a narrow one, is creating new content. And I think the most clear application for me, and I've written about this and done some research on it in the new book and elsewhere, is in creating synthetic data sets, which I think is an invaluable application for finance because we are data poor. Now, it may seem funny to say that relative to natural science, and I'll give you some examples. We're a relatively data poor field. So I'll give you an example. So if you're a drug company that's testing some new medication, well, at the very least, let's say even a phase 3 trial, you're going to have at least a few dozen folks to test on. And before that, there are many more that you are initially testing various aspects of your medication on. But even, let's say, 20 or 30 individuals, it represents 20 or 30 histories. Now, in our case, we only have one history for the S&P 500. So we are limited, and you can't substitute the Russell 2000 for it. It's not the same thing. In a way that humans are essentially substitutable for each other in these types of trials in the pharmaceutical industry. There are various methods of creating synthetic data sets. Some are not new, like Monte Carlo simulation or bootstrapping. But generative AI and a slew of algorithms that are available to actually create out of whole cloth new data sets is invaluable to testing the robustness of strategies. And I think that is one clear, practical, not a pie in the sky application, but one where we desperately need quality control and quality product delivered to us so that we can actually verify and validate the strategy that we're coming up with. So I think that's the clearest application for me. Now, I think a lot of shops are trying to apply these tools. Again, I don't have a full transparency into every firm out there. I will say that in my experience, it's still slow going. Although many firms do want to apply these techniques, I think we're still at the stage where some are still relatively tepid in their inclination to do so. But I think, to your point, even fundamental managers could benefit from this type of technology because, again, when we have an idea or a strategy, we have to really make sure that we're not identifying false positives, but we actually are identifying some sort of exploitable trend or behavior or regularity in the markets. And the only way of doing that, there's only really two ways: using the actual history, but as we know, back tests are susceptible to overfitting and all these other errors that we can make, all these pitfalls, or we have to generate synthetic data that is realistic enough that it is market-like, but different, to test the robustness of our strategy. So I'm very excited about this new wave of application.
Maybe there are two things. One, we were at a conference in London. Maybe we met each other before then, but it seemed to be, this is 2017, 2018, everybody's talking about getting that data set. And maybe initially it was credit card data and drones, et cetera. But then having data sets and exhaust data and data that was not in the public domain, even more valuable. But the lifespan of something like that is quite short, because if that's your edge, it's going to be arbitraged away very, very quickly. And then I read, might have been one of the very first articles in the journal where I think it was you that wrote it. If I remember right, you talked about not so much finding that wholesome data set, but using this data to de-risk an investment process, make the process more robust. And I think, and I might be embellishing this now, but the ability to maybe use some of this data also to get your expense base down, improve your operational side of the business and operational alpha. So I think when this data first came out, there was maybe a corner you could look around on a particular industry or stock idea, but that is fleeting. So is there a separation of understanding between a very good idea versus using this data to improve an investment process? If you could do the latter, I think you're onto something.
Well, when I was mentioning generating synthetic data, I was primarily talking about time series data that I'm excited about. Now, when you talk about alternative data, I think you have to really take it case by case. For example, natural language text data, natural language processing and text data, that has a very long lineage. In other words, the academic foundations of all that work in computational linguistics and formal semantics and so on is very deep. So when you build an NLP algorithm, there's a lot of prior research, really the standing on the shoulders of giants idea that supports the case that we can systematically harness that research to generate useful algorithms for ourselves. Now, that's not necessarily the case for other kinds of alt data, like the visual data that you mentioned with the drones or the satellite technology. Not to say that you can't use that or it's useless. I don't want to poo-poo on anybody's activities out there. But I think because there isn't really a body of research showing that there's clear links to identifying things visually and then monetizing it, I think the jury is still out on robust uses of that data. Again, I'm not necessarily pessimistic on it. I'm just more in a wait and see position, because I don't think some of these alt data types are in the same boat as natural language processing and text data, verbal data, whatever you want to call it, because there just isn't this theoretical or rigorous structure surrounding it. Now, to your point about getting things arbitraged away, well, it depends. I mean, if the data is legally obtained and it is difficult to obtain, then potentially that is a source of information that can be exploited for a while. But if it's something that is readily discovered and you just happen to be the person or persons, the people who discovered it first, then you're right. And eventually others will discover it and exploit that system, that irregularity or that anomaly, and eventually you'll get it arbitraged away.
So does any part of your practice, and maybe you cover this in the journal, this concept of trying to improve the mid and back office, and if you can lower your expense base, and maybe this applies more to the asset owner than the asset manager, you've created alpha through better operations. Is that something you spend any time focusing on? It might be out of your direct remit. There's truly an argument to be made there, but I'm just curious if operational alpha is an area you've focused on at all.
Well, if you're referring to automating certain aspects of your operations, yes, I think those are often the low-hanging fruit applications. Again, not to say that they're easy and there's no work that's needed to make headway in these areas, but I think what happens is often a team, and this is not just, let's call it the front office, the alpha generation team, or even the risk team. Often it's teams like in compliance, where they know they have a dedicated number of individuals on certain tasks, but they see that, if we could just automate 1, 2, or 3 aspects of what each of these individuals is doing, wow, we can actually have them work on more useful things. and have the part that is automated just do what it's doing and save us time and money doing that. I have personally worked on those kinds of projects in a consulting capacity, and I do think they are a relatively unexploited area. It's getting better. I think more and more firms are applying these tools to actually get efficiencies out of the back office or the operational side as well. So that's a good thing to see. And it's spreading to things like compliance departments, like I mentioned. And so, yes, I do think that there is this operational alpha, if you will, or helping the bottom line in your P&L via automation and the application of some of these tools to create efficiency. So I do definitely think that it's not only the sort of the exciting portfolio management side or the risk management side that can benefit from these tools, but even the more, let's call them mundane aspects of the investment business, there's a lot of efficiencies to squeeze out still. But I think firms, by and large, have woken up to this and are really trying to apply things there.
It's all in the data, I guess, is if you take all this data and just dump it into a file, if that's the right term, it's not going to be useful to you. Every piece of data has got to be cataloged. You've got to understand the origin of it, if there's outside ownership who owns it. And if you can spend the legwork doing that, then you're on to something very, very powerful. Maybe related to that, Joe, I don't know if we talk enough about the power of a distributed ledger. It seems oftentimes it's in the background as we talk about the price of Bitcoin versus the power of having your data on an immutable ledger. I've heard some people say that blockchain is a solution in search of a problem. How powerful, how important is blockchain, and is its day in the sun still to come? Because I just don't know if it's gotten the wholesome view that it should have, at least in my opinion.
Just briefly, I do think there is a bright future for these applications because, again, away from crypto, that's a separate conversation, obviously. But you see that a lot of the intellectual property on the blockchain side is owned by credit card companies and sort of very mainstream financial institutions. And that's because they see value in it in terms of the security aspects, the robustness, the validation aspects of a lot of these platforms and tools. And so I do think in various very mainstream applications like credit cards, which is most areas of finance, actually, where you need to protect data and efficiently transfer information from one place to another, I do think there's a bright future for it. Again, it's not my primary area of focus, but from what I've read, and I've read quite a bit about it, I do believe that there is a wide net of applications for this. I think it's only the first couple innings of this, actually.
I agree. It's early. I want to come to FDP, but one more stop before we get there, which is the journal. It's now 6 years old or so. Maybe the evolution of the content, what you're currently writing about, the readership base, and I've looked at some of those articles, and I'm not a techie person myself, and some of them are interesting. Some of them are simply not approachable because I just don't feel I have the right background or vocabulary to really understand the points. So the evolution topics, what is interesting to you now, and a reader base that you're trying to appeal to?
I think the journal appeals on a number of levels. So when we initially started, if you read the first issue, and we have a paper called Triumph of the Empiricist, The Birth of Financial Data Science was the title. And the reason we got together and we had that as the lead-in article, and it's a non-technical, it's a user-friendly article, was because we had initially, and we still do, think to a certain extent that financial data science is really sort of the next evolution of econometrics. Not to talk at too much length about this, I could go on for hours on this topic, but traditional econometrics really had a theoretical foundation and sort of ancestry, if you will. Cowell's Commission at Yale and so on. People can read about it. I've written about it. And as a result of that, a lot of the econometrics profession became, yes, concerned with empirics and empirical study, but also equally as concerned with mathematical formalism and proofs and that kind of development, which is not bad in and of itself, except for the fact that when it comes to financial econometrics or financial data or the use of statistics by investment professionals, we are less concerned with theoretics than practical applications and results, namely generating alpha or preventing the loss of capital. So there's a risk side and an alpha generation side. And so when the journal first started, and even now, we get many papers, and we invite many papers on this topic still, about how machine learning, data science, and traditional econometrics either can work together or separately to help us advance our collective goal, which is to make better forecasts and predictions and to decipher the markets. We still believe in that. I think our interests have expanded from that base. So you could call the initial incarnation of the journal, the next stage in the evolution of a quant journal. It was a quant journal. It still is a quant journal. However, it was very much focused on the econometrics, machine learning, cross-pollination, and evolution side. Now, we're still there. If you read the journal in any given issue, you will see the majority of papers on that topic. But I think we've taken a couple other themes along the way. One is fintech. The editors are interested in, and we know that our industry is interested in fintech applications, research, and even editorials on this work and products that are coming out. Crypto, which we have never shied away from, but we're happy to publish papers on blockchain, on crypto. And so we've kind of opened our arms a little bit to essentially anything technological and mathematical in the realm of finance. And then I think the third leg of that, which is related to the first two, is that we very much welcome now user-friendly editorial pieces. I've written one or two myself. And that's important because in order to introduce the subject matter to those who are not experts yet in it, we feel that it's important to have these sort of non-technical expository editorial type pieces in order to invite more readership in. And so the journal's evolved quite a bit. We've evolved to a certain extent to a let 1,000 flowers bloom type of journal where we're willing to listen and accommodate all different kinds of writing, as long as it's more or less on topic. I feel really good where we're at in terms of readership. But again, for anybody listening, please send your research in. We'll be happy to look at it.
Is it a rated journal and things peer-reviewed? And most of the authors, are they either academics or academics working for a large general partner or asset manager?
It is a rated journal. It's peer-reviewed, of course. It's a mix. We have a lot of folks that submit that work for Wall Street institutions, large and small. But we also have, I would say, almost half of our submissions are academics. And that's a good sign, too, because you do want this cross-pollination of academia and industry. What you don't want, as you have the case with many journals, especially in finance, where it's an issue, is a purely academic journal where only professors are publishing. We want professors to be speaking to practitioners and vice versa and learning from each other and sharing ideas. And I think that's a good mix that we have. We also have a global reach. We have a lot of international submissions coming in, and we are happy to accommodate and welcome those folks as well.
I think there's a sense that parts of Asia Pacific maybe were much earlier than North America in terms of embracing some of these technology tools. And maybe they had a regulatory environment that invited that. Maybe they were more science-y by nature. I don't know. But is that true? Have we seen a faster development and embracement of some of these technical tools in Asia versus North America?
Well, it certainly hasn't been slow from what we can see. I think there is often a willingness to experiment, if you will, in terms of research there, whereas sometimes in the States or Europe, we're a little bit more conservative in terms of rolling out an idea before we've really covered all the bases professionally, senior management, and so on and so forth. In Asia, you often see a lot of ideas that down the road, they end up being very practical, but initially they seem somewhat more theoretical or highly mathematical. But again, I think we accommodate all kinds, so we're happy to look at that. And again, that's the reason why I think it's useful to have a journal that's global in reach, because nobody knows everything. If we're doing something in the States that they're not doing in Asia and vice versa, we want to be speaking to each other in order to facilitate collective learning, if you will. We're happy to accommodate anyone. And again, my advice to any potential authors is don't be afraid to submit, as long as the idea is a quality idea and there's some technical or mathematical basis to it and a practical application that you have in mind, then we will shepherd you through it. I remember the first issue of the journal, we had a graduate student who I think he co-wrote a paper with his advisor, and he was from Africa. He had an interesting idea, very practical. It was technical, but it was very practical. It was an offshoot of CAPM. He was developing CAPM with machine learning in a certain way. We published him, and it was a great paper. It got a lot of good response. So we want to reach into different parts of the world because we know that all the good ideas don't reside in one place. So please send things in. Whoever's listening, send them in.
Encouraging words and platform. I don't want to give short shrift to FDP, admittedly a self-serving topic for both you and me. And to set this up, Joe, I think there were very few people that were at ground zero, myself, Hossein, and you, and maybe a handful of others. And as the story goes, for maybe some of the very reasons we've just talked about, when you approach data science, the vocabulary gets very complicated very, very quickly. And you're starting to embrace tools that as a trained analyst, maybe you never touched before. And maybe trying to figure out what Python and R are all about. And maybe ChatGPT takes care of that for you now. But we felt that there was a gap of learning and understanding between a traditional analyst, Kai or CFA, that was now sitting side by side with somebody that maybe worked at NASA or Google most of her career. And how do these two people communicate in a coach and investment process? And as you just said earlier, Joe, as the story goes, the data scientists can torture that data and make it say anything they want it to say. And the analyst has to have the wherewithal to say, no, this smells like overfitting to me. And to be able to have that wholesome conversation. So FDP was born out of trying to bridge that gap, not for the data scientist and turn that person into an analyst, but the analyst to give them enough to fill that gap. And this was reasonably successful under the guise of you and our advisory committee and Hossein and the small team he brought together. COVID hit, the numbers drew down, we came back the other side. But from Kaya's skinny little not-for-profit balance sheet, it was hard to make a run at this. And we looked at some ideas. We talked to you early, and longer story short, we ended up in a partnership with Alpha Development, and is now on their platform. This next cohort of candidates, the exam window is open, alive and well. Admittedly, we're going through a bit of a transition with the program. I think the curriculum is largely intact, but I think the mission has not changed at all. And I think we're now got continuity with you, a very solid partner in Alpha Development. Paul Monk, who's been very involved, the CEO there, has been a tremendous advocate for this as well. So maybe to start this off, how are things going?
I think they're going very well, very smoothly. We are on outreach mode now for the next exam. The registration period is open, so please sign up and reach out to me if you have any questions, of course. And to articulate the value proposition of FDP, I'll go back to the beginning. So I have to give a lot of credit to you and Hossein, because when the journal just started, a few weeks after, you had called me up and said, oh, by the way, and I believe you had just thought of this on your own, you and Hossein, we're going to launch a certification in this area because we know it's going to be important. And so now years later, I'm still singing both of your praises because I said they really understood that this is going to be something on its own. And it's going to be an area of expertise that investment professionals really need to develop. And I think Hossein recognized, just as I had, and you did as well, that there was somewhat of a confusion to quants on the street, especially, I would say, mid-career or even senior quants, because they had gone through their whole careers learning option pricing, econometrics, regressions, and so on. And now they have a whole new field thrown on them. Not that the two fields are totally divorced, data science and traditional statistics, of course, but there are differences and there are new algorithms to learn and so on and so forth. And the heavy reliance on computing and computational models. And if nothing else, the FDP was designed to serve as a way of showing professionals, here's how all these fields are related, and here's how you can apply them to your work. And cutting through that confusion by itself is a value add, because the traditional quant, who, let's say, isn't a millennial, let's say is a Gen X or a little bit post a Gen Y quant, essentially grew up, like I mentioned, learning other kinds of traditional quantitative methodologies and tools, and then had to slowly evolve or build expertise in these new areas. And for a new entrant into Wall Street, this can be very daunting and challenging. Where do I start? And as you mentioned, there are other certifications which are very good at teaching the investment fundamentals. But when it comes to the more sophisticated applications of data and data science, I think there was a gap that FDP was designed to fill. So now what I tell folks is, look, this certification fulfills a few functions. One is, if you are a new graduate and are thinking about going to grad school or not, whether or not you get a master's degree or even a PhD, which we have FDP charter holders who are PhDs, this could serve as an additional professional credential that signifies your seriousness to learning about these areas. So that's a professional advantage that it may give you. But if nothing else, it actually teaches you all the interconnections between these areas. So then when you go to your job, you can actually apply them with the straight face and a domain knowledge that you need to actually function and apply some of these algorithms, and also set yourself up for further learning. For more seasoned practitioners, let's call them, I think what it can do is say, look, you're a very technically skilled individual and very accomplished professionally, but you may have gaps or may want to just learn about some of these newer areas. The FDP can actually fulfill that function without having to go and take another master's degree or what have you. So there are different ways that the FDP can help professionals, but it's really designed to upskill folks and to really give them a clear-eyed view of how traditional statistics and machine learning and data science are all interconnected and how they can help them in their everyday job. So it's a very practical certification as well.
The primary catalyst to look at this crossroad with sober eyes was Hosseин's retirement. And the reality of us finding another Hossein was challenging. But even Hossein and I talked about this, we probably would need two Hosseins. One who knows what's happening academically, but then somebody external that's in the marketplace every single day talking to the big players in the space. And it's players that we wouldn't normally see in the Kaya curriculum necessarily. So I think a huge benefit to Alpha Development and you, Joe, is that the work that you've done, the work on the journal, you can see the pace of change. And I think the challenge for us, Hossein and I had this conversation maybe with you as well, that I could get 5 or 6 people that have been in this industry for a reasonably long time and ask them about what would be the main pillars of a Kaya program if you focused on alternative investments. And if we wrote that list under cloak of secrecy and then compared, I think we'd find a high correlation one to the next to the next. When it comes to testing data science or alt data or generative AI, I'm not even sure if everybody has the same definition, but if we did that same study, I think we'd have a very low correlation. So I think the challenge for us always was, and now for you, is to figure out what are the most important verticals and then how deep do you go on them. And I think one of the benefits of Alpha is that they have a lot of video-based learning, that maybe there's a series of micro-credentials that could help maybe the more casual aspirant, and then maybe somebody that needs to go deeper as an analyst needs to go all the way in for FDP. So tucked inside there, I guess, is a question, which is, how do you see this curriculum developing over time, and how do you keep pace with the weightings and the learning objectives and the learning outcomes that you expect to really marry up against the objective of trying to cross-skill and upskill that analyst?
Alpha, I will say, I agree with you. They provide the infrastructure and the instructional expertise, because they've been doing this for many years, in terms of program delivery. So as we evolve the program forward, we're going to, with Alpha's help, make everything smoother or user-friendly. Not that it's not user-friendly now, but just make the whole student experience even more seamless than it is now. And so those developments that we are pushing forward with Alpha are very exciting and a big part of their value add. I think when it comes to the curriculum itself, we are setting up curriculum committees that will have industry experts on them that will be giving us information and feedback on the evolution of the exams and the certification. And the reason we're doing that is plainly obvious, which is to keep abreast of the most cutting edge tools that are being applied in the marketplace and to understand what is really needed by employers and industry. And so while I think a portion of the curriculum will be fairly static over time, the basic statistical foundations and econometrics and machine learning fundamentals, the algorithms, and so on, there will be content evolution in order to keep pace with what is on the horizon, so that when we do provide a charter to somebody, it is a very current charter. And to your point, different kinds of badging and so on and so forth are also possibilities to either fill in specific gaps or to provide extended learning opportunities for charter holders.
Joe, we're so pleased to have somebody of your heft of experience, knowledge, the work you've done in the journal, your PhD. Your curiosity is very, very important too, because you got to keep picking up rocks and saying, why is this under there? And I feel it's in very good hands. And Hossein and I humbly and gratefully support you on the advisory committee. I think that I've seen maybe on LinkedIn or someplace else, are you doing info sessions on FDP? And if there are, I could put a link when we produce this podcast.
We have one, so I can send it to you. You can link it up.
All right, I'll put the link there. Is it 2 cohorts a year? Is that the current plan?
It is. And I also want to say that in addition to my info session, I've started a series of webinars where I interview higher profile quants that are out there that have done some real research, some of which are FDP charter holders. Not all of them, but some are. And the idea there is to give folks a reason to visit the FDP site, to engage with us, and to not just be a provider of the charter and the tests, but also to be a provider of access to a lot of high-power individuals. And these webinars are really interviews, but they're, I would say, not necessarily a Tonight Show biographical kind of an interview. They're much more practical applications. So they get a little bit more technical, but that's the feedback that we got, that's what people really want, is people that are experienced coming in to speak about specific applications they've had with various aspects of data science and machine learning. That's really the intent of the webinar series. We recorded our first one this week. It'll be coming out. I have another one on Monday. As we go along, we'll have several more.
Excellent. Well, hopefully this podcast will fan the flame too, not for the product itself. The bills need to be paid, but more to yield better outcomes for the end investor. And I think as somebody coming into the industry today, or maybe somebody mid-career, these could be very frightening times. But when you have disruption, even in the equity markets, which we had this week, that's where the opportunity is, with the great volatility and the great dislocations. And I think it's a very, very interesting time to be working in this industry. It could be very scary if you're not equipped and armed. And I think the message is get off the couch and get engaged. And even if you find that the FDP credential is not for you, you've got to fill these learning gaps. And you really have to understand and talk the language. And even if you're not directly involved in this, you go to a client meeting and they say, well, how are you folks thinking about generative AI? You say, oh, we're not doing that, or maybe next quarter. That is a bad answer. You got to be much more thoughtful because the client has questions too. So, Joe, a great discussion. Always great to see you. Thanks for your continued partnership in FDP. And I very much believe its best days are ahead of us under your leadership. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Bill. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the CHI Association and subscribe to the show at CHIA.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.